Before Lucifer was cast out, before the rebellion was crushed, before silence returned to heaven, there was a moment when everything seemed to shake. Miguel was faced with chaos. It wasn't just an argument between angels. It wasn't just a dispute for authority. It was the first great celestial crisis, a conflict so profound that it divided powerful beings, shook the order of heaven, and revealed something frightening. Even where there was light, rebellion could arise. Imagine for a moment heaven, a place of glory, order, and holiness, filled with tension. Heavenly voices in silence, armies gathered, an impossible decision approaching. And at the center of it all, Miguel. But why him? Why was Miguel the name that appeared at this decisive moment? Who was this celestial warrior before the battle? And what really happened when Lucifer's rebellion advanced to the point of no return? There is a detail that almost no one notices. The war in heaven does not start with swords. It starts with a choice. And when this choice spreads, even the invisible goes to war. In this video, you will understand who Michael was, how the rebellion grew, how the heavenly armies were mobilized, and why the decisive confrontation changed spiritual history forever. But there is something even deeper. Miguel's battle did not just end with the defeat of the rebels. She opened a question that crosses the centuries. When chaos rises against God's order, who remains standing? There is a part of this war that many ignore. When talking about Michael and Lucifer, the attention almost always goes straight to the final confrontation. The fall, the expulsion, the defeat of the rebels. But before the sky saw the enemies falling, something much more dangerous was happening. The rebellion was growing. And she didn't grow up with noise at first. He grew up with ideas, proudly, with influence, with a doubt planted where there was once trust. That's what makes this story so serious. Because Miguel's greatest battle wasn't just against a declared enemy. It was against an invisible rupture that was already spreading among celestial beings. Who was Miguel before this moment? Why did he lead the faithful armies? How did Lucifer manage to drag other angels into his rebellion? And what does this war reveal about the conflict between obedience and pride? But there is one detail. This battle is not just about the past. It points to something bigger, something prophetic, something that still touches humanity. Because when Michael rises up in Scripture, it's usually no accident. There is always a crisis, a threat, a limit being exceeded. And perhaps that is why this war continues to arouse so much curiosity. What happened in the sky at that moment was not just a distant battle. It was the beginning of a conflict that still echoes in history. And to understand why Michael was decisive, we first need to look at who he was before heaven went to war. Michael does not appear in Scripture as a common figure. It always appears linked to moments of tension, confrontation, and protection. When your name is mentioned, there is something at stake. There is a battle going on, a threat rising, a spiritual crisis being revealed, and that already tells us a lot. Miguel is not presented as someone curious, distant, or secondary. He is shown as a heavenly leader, a defender, a warrior directly linked to the people of God and the invisible conflicts that surround human history. But what does the name Miguel mean? The question behind this name is a powerful one. Who is like God? And that's not just a nice phrase. It is a declaration of war against all pride that tries to rise above the Creator. Notice the contrast. While Lucifer wanted to rise, dominate, and occupy a position that did not belong to him, the name Michael itself pointed to the opposite. No one is like God. And this is where everything starts to get deeper. Miguel didn't just represent strength, it represented alignment, order, fidelity. He was on the side of divine authority when the rebellion tried to distort everything. Imagine the weight of that moment. On the one hand, a being overcome by pride, trying to attract others to his own ambition. On the other, Miguel, firm, holding a simple and overwhelming truth. No creature can take the place of the Creator. But there is something that almost no one notices. Miguel didn't need to win based on appearance. I didn't need to convince through vanity. His authority came from fidelity, and in a war born of pride, that made all the difference. Therefore, before looking at the battle, we need to understand his role. Miguel appears as the one who stands up when the conflict goes beyond the limit, when evil advances, when a rebellious force tries to break the order established by God. He is not the center of worship. He doesn't take the glory for himself. He points to God precisely because of his posture. And perhaps that is what makes his presence so remarkable, because in a war where Lucifer wanted to exalt himself, Michael became the symbol of those who remain faithful. But then the inevitable question arises: how did a rebellion manage to advance so far in the sky before being confronted? The rebellion did not start out looking like a war. This is the scariest point. It began as a silent distortion, an idea growing inside Lucifer, a hidden desire, an ambition that little by little stopped being just a thought and began to become an influence. And this is where the danger reveals itself, because not every fall begins with a visible act. Many begin with a small exchange. Reverence gives way to pride. Gratitude gives way to dissatisfaction. Obedience gives way to the poisonous question, what if I deserve more? Lucifer did not advance alone. The rebellion spread because others began to listen. Others began to consider. Others began to look at God's order as if it were a limitation rather than a protection. But there is one detail. A lie only becomes powerful when it appears to contain some truth. And perhaps that was how the crisis progressed. Not as an open threat, but as a suggestion. Not as a scream, but as a whisper. And then the sky, which was a place of perfect order, began to witness something impossible to ignore. A division. On the one hand, those who remained faithful. On the other, those who allowed themselves to be carried away by a dangerous promise, the idea of existing far from God's authority. But how could this happen between celestial beings? This question is uncomfortable because it reveals something profound. The rebellion was not born from a lack of light. It was born from the rejection of light. Lucifer did not fall because he was unaware of glory. He fell because he desired glory that did not belong to him. And when this desire found followers, the crisis was no longer internal. It became collective. Heaven wasn't just dealing with a rebel. I was facing a movement, a spiritual break, a threat against the heavenly order itself. And at that point, there was no longer any way to delay. The rebellion had advanced too far. The influence had already spread. The conflict was already formed. Now, heaven needed to respond. And when the decisive moment arrived, the heavenly armies began to move. Then came the moment when heaven needed to choose It was no longer possible to observe in silence. The rebellion had ceased to be a hidden shadow. Now she stood before the heavenly order as a real threat. And when the threat reveals itself, neutrality disappears. Who would remain faithful? Who would follow pride? Who would be left standing when the division came to a head? It is in this scenario that Miguel rises, not as someone seeking glory for themselves, not as someone trying to prove superiority, but as leader of the faithful armies, faced with a crisis that required an immediate decision. And this is where everything changes, because heavenly mobilization was not just combat preparation. It was a separation, a visible sign that heaven would not allow rebellion to eternally contaminate what belonged to God. Imagine this scene. Celestial beings gathered, heavy silenced, order being restored not by negotiation with pride, but by loyalty to the divine throne. Miguel was ahead, and behind him, those who were not seduced by the rebellious promise, those who understood that no true freedom is born against God. But there was a question hanging in the air. How far would Lucifer go? Because pride, when unrepentant, always advances. He doesn't stop at desire. He demands space. It demands a voice, demands throne. And now, in front of Miguel, the rebellion would find its limit. The sky was about to witness not just a battle, but a response. The answer against lying, against ambition, against the creature that tried to defy the Creator. And when the heavenly armies moved, it was clear there would be no return. The decisive confrontation was about to begin. The battle began when the rebellion finally met resistance. Michael and his angels advanced. On the other side, Lucifer and those who followed him no longer hid their choice. What had once been silent influence had now become open opposition. And at that moment, heaven saw something that should never have existed there. Conflict. But it wasn't just any conflict. It was loyalty against pride, order against rebellion, truth versus lies. And Miguel was at the center of that response, not as someone driven by hatred, but as someone steadfast in the face of a threat that could not continue. Because when rebellion tries to take the place of truth, truth must rise up. But there is one detail. Miguel's strength was not just in heavenly power. It was in what he represented. His very name confronted Lucifer's ambition. Who is like God? That question ran through the battle like a sentence. Who is like God? Lucifer wanted to go up. Miguel remained faithful. Lucifer wanted exaltation. Michael defended the authority of the Most High. And this is where the confrontation becomes bigger than an image of war. It becomes a revelation. Because that battle showed that evil doesn't win just by appearing strong. He tries to win by confusing, seducing, distorting. But when the truth is exposed, the lie loses ground. The rebels resisted. The tension grew. The heavenly order faced its greatest test. But Miguel didn't back down. And perhaps this is the most powerful scene. In the face of chaos, he remained steadfast. In the face of division, he led. Faced with a creature that tried to surpass the limit, he stood up. Heaven was not just expelling rebels. He was declaring that God's authority could not be taken. And then the confrontation reached the decisive point. The rebellion, which had begun with pride, now faced its final consequence. The movement that promised greatness began to reveal its true face: separation, fall, and loss. Because every pride that defies God carries an illusion. He promises height, but it leads to the abyss. And when Michael and his angels prevailed, it became clear that the rebellion did not have the strength to sustain what it had promised. Lucifer couldn't win. His followers were unable to remain. The lie failed to occupy the sky. But before the final fall, one last truth was revealed. There is no throne for the creature that tries to take the place of the Creator. And after that confrontation, nothing would be the same. Then came the fall. The rebellion that tried to rise was thrown downwards. Lucifer and his followers did not remain in heaven. They lost the place they had. They lost their position. They lost communion. And what seemed like a quest for greatness ended in expulsion. This is the strongest irony in the story. Lucifer wanted to rise, but he fell. I wanted domain, but lost access. He wanted to be like God, but he was revealed as a rebel, and Miguel, who did not seek his own glory, remained a symbol of fidelity. But there is a detail that makes this defeat even more serious. The expulsion of the rebels did not end the conflict for humanity. It only revealed where the conflict would start to act more strongly. Heaven was cleansed of rebellion, but spiritual warfare would continue to echo throughout creation. And this is where the story touches you. Because this battle isn't just about ancient angels. She talks about choices, about pride, about loyalty, about the danger of listening to a lie until it seems true. The defeat of the rebels shows that no power contrary to God remains standing forever. But it also raises an unsettling question. If the rebellion was expelled from heaven, why are its effects still felt on earth? This answer brings us to Miguel's role after the war. After the war, Miguel does not disappear from biblical history. It continues to appear linked to protection, conflict, and prophetic moments. When Miguel gets up, something serious is happening. A spiritual boundary is being marked. A crisis is reaching its limit. And that changes the way we look at it. Miguel is not only remembered for the war in heaven, it becomes a sign that God does not abandon his order, his people, nor his purposes. But there is something even deeper. Michael's victory points to a truth that runs throughout the Bible. Evil may advance for a time, it may deceive, it may appear strong, but it does not reign forever. And when Michael appears in a prophetic context, the message is clear. There is a limit to rebellion, a limit to chaos, a limit to lying. Therefore, this war does not just belong to the past. It reveals a pattern that continues today. Every time pride tries to take the place of obedience, the same question comes back. Who is like God? And perhaps this is the most important part. Miguel doesn't point to himself. He points to the throne, to divine authority, for the certainty that no shadow can extinguish the light of God. But then the final question remains. If this war started in heaven, where is it being fought now? And perhaps the answer is closer than it seems. Because every great spiritual war also passes through the human heart. Michael remained faithful when heaven was divided. Lucifer fell when he decided to follow his own pride. And now, each person also faces choices that reveal direction, loyalty, and faith. The question is not just what happened in that battle. The question is, what does this battle reveal about you? When truth confronts pride, whose side do you take? When the voice of God calls for faithfulness, do you remain firm, or are you carried away by empty promises? This war began in heaven, but its echo still touches the earth. And perhaps that's why Miguel's story remains so powerful. because she reminds us that chaos can arise, lies can seem strong, and rebellion can seem seductive. But in the end, only those who are on God's side remain standing. And now, I want to know, for you, what is the greatest lesson from Miguel's battle? This is the point that can be ignored. Michael's battle does not just end with a victory in heaven. She leaves a message for everyone who still lives in doubt, pressure, and confusion. Because the question is still alive: who is like God? When pride promises freedom, when lies seem attractive, when chaos tries to seem stronger than the truth, this question comes back, and it separates paths. If this story spoke to you, leave it in the comments. Which side do you believe humanity is choosing to be on today? Because perhaps the greatest battle is not yet the one that took place in heaven, but what happens when each heart needs to decide who it will follow.